All right, welcome everyone to our third meeting where we will be discussing how to prepare your part one of three parts CAB-MR paper for success. You will be submitting that on or before March 2nd. We'll look forward to reading it. And when your part one has passed muster, we say, yes, indeed, your definition is clear, it's precise, it's observable, it's measurable. And the other aspects, we have selected an appropriate data recording procedure based upon the dimension that concerns us. And then once you've collected the data, this is now for part two, which we'll be discussing the next time we meet. You'll be analyzing the data. You'll be making some sense of it. You'll be placing it into some sort of graphic form, a bar chart, a line graph, something along that line, into some organized table. And you will explain how you'll be implementing the various practices and procedures that we find in the learning modules for part two that are found on our no longer Blackboard, our Brightspace site. Part three is completely unrelated to the first two parts, and that's down the road several weeks from now when we'll have a session regarding how you can structure your paper for success, part three. And of course, you can find guidelines for all of the three parts of the paper inside the left sidebar link on our class site. It's a labeled description of CAB-MR papers. And there you'll find, yes, indeed, an explanation of what we're looking for. And you'll also find some exemplars, some wonderful papers from previous semesters. You can look at those and gain an idea of the structure of the paper and the content of the paper and exactly what we're looking for. But parts one and two, why are we collecting data and analyzing it? Well, first of all, it's going to be a part of your teaching career, if it isn't already, that when we're in the RTI process, I'm hoping you remember these terms from SPED 700.5. There's the pre-referral process where a team comes into the room and suggest strategies for helping certain learners to perform better. Uh, but if they don't work, those strategies, then it's time to do an evaluation and perhaps an IEP, a special ed document, is developed. If there are concerns about behavior, then they may conduct an FBA, and you should be able to express what is the words that that acronym represents. Functional behavior assessment. What is the function, the drive, the reason, the cause for that behavior? And if we do indeed find that this student is in need of special strategies to make better behavior choices, then we create a part of the IEP known as the BIP. And again, you're spelling out that acronym in your mind, a behavior intervention plan. And with this response to intervention and the PBIS model, which are part of the multi-tiered systems of support, hopefully again covered in SPED 700.5. These procedures require that we contribute two types of data: qualitative data, non-numerical, non-number data, and quantitative data, numbers data. It'll also behoove you, these parts one and two, in taking the Students with Disabilities exam, which is upcoming for all of you folks. There's a lot of material on that state exam with regards to what we cover here in this course. So again, those exemplars are there, and we have the different parts of the CAB MR. You'll see, first of all, we want some background regarding what's the neighborhood like where the student lives? What's the neighborhood like around the school? And then a little bit about your school, which if you're in a New York City Department of Education school, you can go to your school's website and you'll find out all sorts of things, number of students, number of kids on a free or reduced lunch plan, the demographic makeup of your school. And then supply some information on the family unit of your focus learner, if indeed you're privy to that information. If not, you'll want to be sure to mention that you do not have access to that information. And then a bit about the focus learner. Tell us all about, you know, aspects of his or her development and identification. A little bit about the student's behavior in the school and the home, if you happen to be privy to that information. And this is the section where you place the information that a lot of people want to place in the target behavior definition section. But as we'll explain as we move further on into the evening, the definition is one, maybe two sentences. It's very precise. It only describes the behavior. Examples of it, elaboration upon it, not in the target behavior section. Put it earlier in the paper, section 2. Yeah, you will also be identifying in part 1 the dimension of the behavior. What aspect of this student's behavior makes it different from the way other kids display that behavior? Is it how often it happens? Is it how long it happens? Is it the way that it's done? Okay. You'll be discussing the dimension. And you'll be identifying the recording procedure you're going to use. We will be getting into that either late to this session or early in the next session. How does one select an appropriate behavior recording procedure? Will you be using duration recording? Will it be frequency recording? Will it be momentary time sampling? Will it be partial interval or will it be whole interval recording? We'll tell you how to select one that is appropriate. Well, we want to look at
maybe I could do the next two slides. Yeah.
Certainly,
Yeah.
Dr. T.
Do you want me to do the next two slides, Dr. Mack, or?
Oh, please do.
Also, there's a couple of questions that came up on the chat. Great questions. You do not have to the kid does not have to have an IEP to do part 1 or part 2. I think what we're attempting to say is that this is a practice to help you in your work, and it could have bearings on a kid that has an IEP, whether you're going to discuss a BIP or functional assessment. But in this case, the student that you're working on doesn't have to have an IEP. Just that it's a connection to things that might be involved with your IEP. That makes sense? Yeah, it's good. Yeah. So we said thank you. So a couple things here that we want to get into, like how can we be successful in part 1? You want to identify and define the recurrent behavior. Now, many of you will start out and you'll be identifying many different behaviors that are going on because it'd be so nice if it was just one behavior that was being challenging, but often there's multiple behaviors. So your job is to work through the context that Dr. Mack said, the school, the setting, and then maybe I tend to write down all the behaviors and then focus on one behavior that seems to be recurrent. And then step 2, then when you have that, you determine the dimension. So for people in my class section that have submitted, I've commented on this, that you've identified maybe one, two, three target behaviors, and you might have a choice based on the dimension that you want to look at. Um, so all those things are important. So sometimes it's helpful to write down, hey, I have multiple behaviors that I'm looking at, and I have multiple dimensions, and then choose. But ultimately, what Dr. Mack is saying is you want to focus in on one target behavior and then identify that dimension, and then decide the type of behavior recording that's going to be used. So what I've noticed over the years is that people will have multiple types of target behaviors in their sentence. Oh, the student acts out, doesn't, throws things, throws a temper tantrum when the middle of transition. Also, while the teacher is speaking, often when they're called on a redirection. Now, all of those things could be target behaviors and very specific to that situation. So we have to narrow it down. That's how you'll be successful with this. And that's how you'll be able to do your observations. So that's why we have this class, and really the earlier thing that you can submit to both of us so we can give you feedback about that. And it's about narrowing down the target behavior. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Mack now.
Well, thanks again. And as we were talking about those observations, well, how many do I need to do? And it really varies. It's difficult to take data when you're also teaching. There are so many duties involved in teaching our class, and taking data, that's one more thing added on. There are some simple ways to take data, and if you're wondering how you can do that, drop by my office hours and I'll be glad to share some ways in which you can collect data without it interfering with your teaching duties. Things like having a thread and tying a knot in it every time you see the behavior, or having coins in your pocket, and each time the behavior happens, you move the coin from one pocket to another pocket, and you'll know how many times that behavior happened. And a number of observations of 30 to 45 minutes. And what's that number? Well, let's talk about it during office hours. So when we're talking about the third of the 5 parts of the CAB-MR Part 1, third part, we're identifying the student's behavior, exactly what it is. We need to know that, you know, if somebody came into your room and said, I'll collect some data for you today, they need to know when that behavior is happening. So it's important that our behavior be precise and defined, and defining that action in a way that is, to use the data recorder's mantra, OM, OM. Yes, observable and measurable and precisely worded. And we have to avoid general everyday terms and give it a lot of precision, our definition. So words like quickly and loudly and threatens others and cursing, we need to define exactly what it is that is going on, not these generalized terms. Has to be measurable. Perhaps uh, you'd like to measure the magnitude of a student's verbiage, and you're saying, I don't have a decimeter, I don't have a device that will record how many decibels loud that outburst is. And so we might break it into a 1 to 5 scale with, or actually probably a 0 to 5 scale, from 0 being silent when we observe, to 1 being a whisper, to 2 being a table voice, to 3 being the loudness needed when one is asking a question of the teacher during the class. Maybe 5 is the outdoor voice used out there in the yard. It could be the yes or no marks, which we would be using for it either happened or didn't happen when I looked over. We'll talk about that dimension and that recording procedure in a bit. Or it could be that we use a timepiece to measure how long the behavior happened when it did happen that one time, which you know is being what kind of recording? Indeed, duration recording. So, which of these examples are precise, succinctly worded, and we can actually witness the behavior? We're not doing any mind reading. We're not saying, oh, does that for attention. No. That's that's jumping too far ahead. In our functional behavior assessment, we'll look at the function. Right now, we're just defining the behavior when it pops up a singular time, one time. So how about this first one here? And this is something you should just answer in your head. If you'd like to answer it by placing it, your thoughts into the chat box, certainly feel free to do so, but not necessary. So a student is constantly out of the seat. What are you thinking? Precisely defined? Observable? Measurable? All right, so what is meant by out of seat? Is it sitting on one calf on the chair, and so really not in contact with the chair? Is it being body fully out of contact, totally out of contact with desk and chair? We need to define what we mean by out of seat. And constantly? Nobody can constantly do anything except breathe. Yes, it seems that way sometimes. Some of our kids with overactive behavior spend a lot of time out of the seat, but probably not constantly. Well, how about this one regarding the seat? Student is not in seat. If you're not yet familiar with one of the requirements for a precise definition, we try to avoid negative words, what are known as void words. Words like not, never, won't. We can't measure what doesn't happen. What is the student doing? You will be measuring student in seat behavior, what the student does do. And we have to, again, define what we mean by seat. Well, how about this one here? The body is completely out of contact with chair. If 3 different people were observing this student, would they all agree whether that behavior is happening or not? I think that's a pretty good definition there, that there is no contact between the student and the chair. If that occurs, then the student, it meets our definition for being out of seat. And how about these remaining ones regarding the seating? Are they all looking good to you? Do some not meet the criteria? Well, numbers 4 through 7 are part of what is known as a shaping plan. I used this with a student back in the day when I was out there teaching in the classroom. I had a very active student. And what was defined as in seat when we were initially trying to get the student to be more so closer to what we considered appropriate in-seat behavior, but we knew we had to do it in steps. And so we talked with, let's use the name Tony, and said, look it, we will consider you to be in your seat if any part of your body is in contact with any part of the chair. At least we have that student in one place and near and in contact with the seat. And then as we worked on reinforcing him for that, he became proficient in that number 4. Then we upped the ante. We made it more difficult for him. We moved closer to what is considered appropriate seating, buttocks in contact with horizontal plane of the chair. And when he was competent at that, we had, let's say, 85% accuracy. When we were when a bell dinged and we were looking for it, buttocks in contact with the horizontal plane and at least 1 foot touching the ground. And then we moved on to number 7, having the back against the backrest. And actually, I don't agree with number 7, because how can the student do the work if they have their hands folded on the desktop? So sometimes we can go overboard in what we expect, but it doesn't matter what you call the behavior. Call it snarzelfarf, make up a word, but be sure you are defining the behavior in an observable and measurable way. Like,
Dr. Mack,
yes.
We have an example in the chat, and maybe this would be a good way to illustrate this. So Taylor says, my student gets out of his seat during lessons and at any moment does the NSYNC bye 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 dance. And then she says, is that usable as a target behavior? Before Dr. Mack responds, I would just suggest, I think that's a great point to start, but maybe use the criteria that Dr. Mack just stated. How defined is it so that somebody else other than yourself could come in and observe and measure what is happening, so it'd be the same thing as you are observing, Taylor? But your initial description seems to be in the right direction. Maybe there's something that we can hone in and be more specific about that.
Indeed.
Dr. Mack, what do you want to say?
Well, I'm imagining myself coming in and doing some observation in the classroom. So a student gets out of the seat. And again, I'm not quite sure what out of seat means. Does that mean body totally out of contact with the chair? And I suspect it does in this case, but I would like to know for certain. And I'm not familiar with the NSYNC bye 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 dance, and so I wouldn't know whether it was happening or not. So before my data collection, you would need to demonstrate it for me, and I would enjoy that.
And I would probably, I don't know, Taylor, if you're in Dr. Mack or my section, but if you're in my section, I'd probably approach this as 2 separate behaviors. Because because there are 2 behaviors: getting out of your seat, whatever that means, and then doing this dance. And I could record both of those if you narrow down what it means to do the dance and try to look at the antecedents and things that happen around the dance versus just getting out of the seat. Even though they might be related on your initial observations, we want to look very specifically, are they 2 separate behaviors and possibly having separate antecedent and consequences? So we need to go a little bit deeper and be more specific. And thank you for putting the heart there. I appreciate that you responded to us. Yes, go ahead, Dr. Mack. It seems like we're on the right direction. We're helping people out.
Yes, and if I were collecting data regarding both of those, I'd probably make a tally mark when the student is out of the seat and add an asterisk behind that tally mark if he then did the dance. And I could look back and see how many tally marks there were without an asterisk, just out of seat, and how many had the asterisk, which I knew he was doing the dance. Now, I'm okay with these two individuals you see here sitting, and because I was teaching in a self-contained class for kids with conduct disorders, streetwise aggressive, manipulative behavior patterns. And as long as they were engaged in the lesson, I didn't much care how they sit, just buttocks in contact with horizontal plane of chair. And other people would say, no, in my classroom, I expect more. I expect them to be facing toward the speaker, well, the front of the class, or back against the back of the chair, nose pointed toward speaker or object of lesson, you know, things along that line. We all have different expectations. Yes, a little bit of assistance, ways we can help ourselves be precise, observable, and measurable in our definition is to make a T-chart. You just draw that T, lowercase t, across your paper, and what do you see when the behavior is happening? And what do you hear when the behavior is happening? So if we say a student calls out the answer or talks out during the lesson or responds impulsively, well, what does that mean? What do I witness when that happens? Oh, the hand is raised above the top of the head, but the student doesn't, well, the student needs to wait for the teacher to acknowledge him, her, or them before offering that answer.
So we just have a couple comments in the chat before we get to behavior number two. For two, puts precise but not measurable in a question mark. Everything that we are doing here has to be measurable and observable. So the precision, if it's great, but if it's not measurable and observable, not just by yourself, by somebody else, your peers, then that is where it becomes problematic. And often, and I think Brittany says this, can you provide an example? The We're not using one dimension to observe. So that's where it's important that you do the modules beforehand and take the quiz, because if we were all working on just observable behaviors in the classroom, which would basically be frequency, right? For the most part, that would mean one thing, but things might be duration, and then you have to be duration can mean things in different aspects, so such as the duration of how much time it takes when a kid goes out of the classroom to go to the bathroom and then comes back. But we have to be very precise about the behavior that we're measuring, whether it's the optimal behavior, like we want them in the classroom, or the time outside of the classroom, and what that means so somebody else could observe that. And then also we have the dimension of intensity, which often gets associated with safety issues like self-injury. So we might want to measure not so much the frequency, but how intense that self-hurting is, and then what's causing that. And then Brittany also put a good comment on there. I don't really quite know what you mean. Provide example how you might describe a student eloping for this purpose.
Oh,
I don't know
okay.
what that means, Brittany. Can you elaborate a little bit more what you mean by eloping for this purpose?
I think I might have an idea, Dr. Turner, which
Okay, great. Go with
for
that.
those of you unfamiliar with the term elopement, except somebody putting a ladder up against a window and somebody climbing down and then taking off to get married, elopement means to leave. And we're probably talking about a student who is leaving the classroom. But what exactly do we mean by leaving the classroom? And one of the definitions that has been used in previous semesters is um, bodily, the student exits fully through the classroom door into the hallway. And that we can observe, and we could measure. And is that what we were thinking about?
Yeah, she put in there, I I mean to say that the word specific enough for do you need a more detailed explanation. So I would just say that Dr. Mack really likes it to be precise and in a couple sentences. My training growing up in California was to be a little bit more detailed and all the specific examples that would count for that observable behavior. And I think there is a balance in there. And I think what you'll find is in both of our feedback that whether you're in my section or his section, that if we don't see enough detailed explanations for it to be recorded, we'll let you know. If it's enough for us to come in and also observe the same thing we think you're going to observe, then we'll give that to you. That's why we have the early submissions and we ask you to submit early. So not only we can give feedback, but also we're not the experts. Maybe even today you can share your behavior, target behavior with people in your groups and get feedback. Because ultimately, we're Dr. Mack and I aren't going to be the ones that are your peers. Well, maybe me more than Dr. Mack because I still work in schools, but and ultimately you're gonna have to work this out with your peers so that you're on the same track on what you're going to observe when you work together. I'll give it back to Dr. Mack. Thanks for that. Thank you for taking that time, Dr. Mack. They said that's good. Good.
All right, super. And as we look at the screen here, we'll see that along with precisely defining a behavior, there's some other things that have to be in play. What is noted? We look at what happens, we define the behavior as if it happens one time, because when you see it, you want to know that it's happening in this particular moment. So you're going to define the behavior as if it happens one time. We'll get a bit more into that and you'll have a chance to practice it. Keep it in the present tense because when you see the behavior, it's in the present tense, in the moment. So you're going to word your definition in the present tense. Now, the word will come into play in part two when you develop a goal for the student, a behavior goal, a behavior objective. Then you'll use the word will. But for our definition of the behavior recording, keep it in the present tense. And you see an example down there at the bottom. This seems to be measuring latency. Focus learner begins engagement in that action within 10 seconds. So we have the stimulus, the direction, and the student engaging within 10 seconds. So it looks like latency recording there. Some things we have to make certain we don't do when we're devising a definition. And that is going beyond that one or two sentences, that succinctly worded definition. Here's an example from a previous semester. And as I was reading it, I said, whoa, this is akin to one of those Where's Waldo cartoons. I'm looking for the definition in all the background. And so we see here, we talk about Nicholas's behavior being unsafe, and you got to make it a priority, and we want him to have a safe body. And oh, there it is. Somewhere hidden in all that verbiage is unsafe is defined anytime Nicholas is grabbing, pushing, hitting, biting, kicking, scratching, or throwing objects at peers or teachers. Went on to talk about how often that happens and where it happens most, but that fluff, as we call it, stuff, the fluff in the second part of the paper where you're talking about the student, talking in general terms, move it up to section 2 of the 5 sections, but not in the third section, the definition. And yes, indeed, don't never say not, no how, no way, because we want to measure what is happening, something we can observe. We can't measure what doesn't exist. And so there are some exceptions to that rule, but very few. What we want to do is describe what is happening. So we flip the behavioral pancake, so to speak, for off task instead of it being is not working after being told not to be on task. Well, engaged in actions other than the one directed by the teacher. So we told the student to get to work on the assignment. The student ain't doing it. Yes, but what is the student doing? Something else. Actions other than the one directed by the teacher. And the word does is much too vague. The student does the assignment. Well, what do we mean by does? Oh, completes it or is engaged in doing it. But let's avoid the words do and does. So here we go again. In your mind, think about whether this definition here is indeed observable and measurable. So Baekhyun hits other students for revenge. Okay. You're moving it around up in the brain, looking at it from different angles, and you say, you know, it's mighty good, except for the revenge part. I can't crack open that kid's skull, look inside, and say, aha, there's the intention, revenge. That's something we take an educated guess with uh, during our functional behavior assessment.
Everybody's saying no, Dr. Mack. And
All right,
everybody's saying no, and you can't say revenge.
exactly. Well done, folks. But how about Amina here? She displays separation anxiety every day. And gosh,
Measure, every day is a no-go. Not measurable at this one, no.
all right, you're picking up on
Uh,
the points that need to be replaced or refined. What do we mean by separation anxiety? Is it crying? Is it holding on to the parent's clothing? What is it? And every day, well, our data will tell us whether it's every day. So we don't put
Zoe
that in the
said,
definition.
does separation anxiety need to be defined?
Yes,
That's a
indeed.
loaded question, Zodi. We're not defining. Separation anxiety is a term often associated in diagnosis that a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a guidance counselor, a social worker all might define differently, but they definitely use a different way to define that. So for us as teachers, most of us aren't experts in that area. We would have to shift over to what behaviors would be displayed that we can measure that might be as a result of that separation anxiety and what behaviors would be look fors. So that's where your collaboration with those experts might help you to see if those look for behaviors are exhibited and then focus on a look for behavior.
Right. When mental health professionals are making that separation anxiety diagnosis, they're probably doing so using very specific criteria in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association or the International Classification of Diseases. And so they are using precise criteria for that diagnostic label. So Goldie says that she's hearing voices that are not reported to be heard by others in the classroom. Okay, she says out loud she's hearing voices. No one else is hearing them. What do we see in the chat, Dr. Turner?
Uh, I This one we're not getting as much responses because I think people are contemplating that. We have
And
one good, one. This is what I put out to there. Goldie states that she's hearing voices, so clearly, right? You can measure and observe the amount of times that she states that she's hearing voices. William says thumbs up. But is that the behavior that you want to observe when she states that she's hearing voices? Or are you trying to observe when she does hear voices? Sorry to put a little wrinkle
was that
into
a
that one.
question to me?
Well, that's a it's a question. I'm just a it's a high yeah, I think it's a maybe
Okay. Well,
well, it's a
certainly,
question to kind of think about on that one. That's
certainly a
all.
week we are concerned about the hearing of voices, and that is something we want to assess, but we have to do so in an observable and a measurable way and collect some data on it. So actually, I think this is quite a good definition. We know no one else has reported it being heard. She reports it being heard, and we make a notation that indeed the behavior that we've defined here has occurred if it does occur. Now, Satish fails to comply with the teacher direction within 10 seconds. Is that something we could say, aha, indeed, I can tell whether that has happened or not? And in the interest of time, we just compare my answer with what you're thinking. And if there's some sort of conflict in the disagreement, let's bring it up and let's talk about it. So Satish fails to comply
We have
with,
a couple people that said you can't say fail. Fail's like saying no. Fail is a negative term on that one.
then I'm going to have to slap myself on the wrist for defining incorrectly. I'm looking at it and thinking I would observe and measure that. Okay, teacher gives a direction. Aha, saw that. And I do my 1 elephant, 2 elephant, 3 elephant count. And when I get to 10 elephants, I can see whether that student has complied or not. And I can make a yes mark or a no mark and figure out the percentage of times that Satish complies with a teacher direction. We can talk about these after class. We could talk about them in the break room. We can, our breakout room. We can talk about them during our office hours. And we're, Dr. T and I are quite,
Yeah.
uh, quite pleased to take a quick look at your definitions as they're developing and give you some feedback. All right.
I think the most important thing for me, and I would just say this to all of you, is that th these aren't perfect science. Uh, it does require working with other people, whether it's Dr. Mack and myself or your peers, because you got to make sense of these things. These are different suggestions. Like even in number three, Goldie orally states that she's hearing voices that are not reported to be heard by others, which is pretty clear to Dr. Mack that that is something that's observable and measurable. And William pointed out some really good questions in the chat, which get into part two. Because if it's really observable and measurable, then you start thinking about your antecedent and your consequence, the context for these things when they happen. But let's don't overthink it. Right now, we're just trying to get to the point, can we record the data so that the data means something, not to be make a pun of it, in an objectable and measurable way, versus like putting the cart before the horse and saying, oh, this is the antecedent, this is the consequence. We need to collect data. So a lot of these things are about, can we collect data that is meaningful and that we can discuss with other people and people understand it? So don't view it as like being perfect. View it as like you can come talk to us in different ways and we'll be there to support you to make that. But ultimately, that'll make part two a lot easier if the data really does work and you have something to talk about.
Right.
So I think now, Dr. Mack, we're going to thank you for that expression. And I know that maybe people will go back and watch the recording. I thought the recording was really good. We covered a lot of stuff. So I definitely encourage you to go back to the recording. But now we would like to put you into small groups. And if we could go to that slide. And we're not going to spend a lot of time in the small groups. It's not, we didn't, some people might have things to share today, not have share. But what I would like you to think about is in your small groups, we're going to put you into groups of three. Everybody gets a chance. If you have a target behavior that you're working on, great. Share that and get feedback from the other people in the group using the criteria and then switch it over to somebody else. And if something's coming up where you can't find agreement, then maybe when we come back, we could talk about it. Or, as Dr. Mack said, you could stay after and ask us individually or do our office hours. Or I'd also encourage you, particularly in my section, to use the option to submit things early and get our feedback that way as well. Okay? But we want to give you a chance to kind of work together. And if you don't have anything, your participation today should be whoever's in your group to give them feedback around a target behavior that you're thinking about. If nobody in your group has a target behavior or student right now, please talk about the examples that we provided. Any of those would be fine to talk about that and see if you can find consensus about that. And by consensus, we mean what is the behavior that you're observing and what's the dimension that you would work on to start your recording. Don't worry about your recording procedure now. Just what's the dimension that you would be working on to do that recording? Your whole group was like, I'm just confused about the assignment or something in there that you'd like to share to the whole community.
I had a quick question. So, me and my partner are both in kindergarten this year. Is it okay? I know that the program is 1 through 6. Is it all right to use a kindergarten student?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, we do. Well, Dr. Mack and I work in the behavioral disorders. There's people in this class that are not. There's a classroom management class. And again, I want to reiterate this, especially since it's recording. This is not specific to just kids with IEPs or having a diagnosis. This could be in any type of class. And we're just learning how to practice recording behavior, analyzing that behavior, and then part three, which is a little separate, looking at the whole overall classroom management system. Hopefully that clarifies.
And as you go into the part 2 modules, you will be learning about a whole lot of strategies that span the 3 tiers of the positive behavior intervention supports pyramid. These strategies that are designed for all kids to help them make good choices in the classroom, or tier 2, some of the kids who need a bit more direction and guidance, and a few kids, the third top of the pyramid, kids who really need a whole lot of guidance. And so you'll be learning strategies for all, some, and few kids for part 2 and 3.
I think you're good. So Dr. Mack, you want to take us to our closing? Awesome.
Yes, indeed. Yes, some of the things that to include exclude from our definition, those words that are much too general in the way of prevalence, that put things into categories without picking out a particular behavior in that category. We certainly want to be specific in our wording, avoiding the reasons for the behavior. That the team will figure out, the IEP team will figure out what is the reason, what is the function, but not in our definition. That word does And yeah, any attempts at figuring out what's going on up in the kid's head. One thing that that I saw in the chat while you folks were in the breakout room was somebody was mentioning that the word fails in one of the definitions we were looking at falls into that void word category that goes along with not, never, doesn't, won't. However, fails is an action verb. Failing is something that happens. And so we would say that if you do need to express a negative, do so with the word fails to, the words fails to, because fails is an action word. Failing is an act. So as we move onward, well, now that you've got a workable definition, when you do have a workable definition that's been approved by Dr. Turner or myself, then you can start collecting data regarding it. Perhaps you're really certain about your definition and you start collecting data, and that'll be just fine if your definition is indeed meeting the criteria. If not, then we'll ask you to trash the data you've been collecting and then restart with the new observable and measurable definition. Yes, and what you will be engaging in is what's called collection of baseline data. The prevalence of the behavior before we intervene. Now, in part two, you don't actually have to intervene. You might decide to do so. We're quite impressed with that. However, you need to apply various strategies hypothetically. Okay? What would you do? And then you would continue collecting data to see if there's any progress in the behavior, if you decided to do so. Now, you'll probably be choosing one of 4 dimensions to measure out of the 6. How often the behavior happens, how long the behavior happened when it presented itself one time. You'll then be figuring out an average for part 2. The magnitude or the latency. The other 2 dimensions help us to further refine those 4 that we've already talked about, the form of the behavior and where it happens. You may want to take a screenshot or a phone photo of what you see on the screen here, even though it will be presented again and will be available in the video. But this is a flow chart for helping you determine which of the recording procedures to use for your observable, measurable, and precisely defined definition of behavior.